She thought she was beyond saving, but a divine plan was already in motion to protect her. Ella stared at the clock above her desk, its ticking growing louder with each passing second. The office was empty now, everyone else having gone home hours earlier. She should have left too, but she couldn't bring herself to face the quiet emptiness of her apartment. She leaned back in her chair, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the edge of her desk. The weight of the day and of the last several years pressed down on her chest like a stone. Her life hadn't always been like this. She used to be the kind of person others described as full of light, the one everyone turned to for encouragement. But that light had dimmed long ago, extinguished by heartbreak, betrayal, and a series of poor choices she couldn't seem to forgive herself for. Now, she felt like a shadow of her former self, barely getting by, held together only by the fragile threads of routine. That afternoon, she'd gotten the news she had feared most. She'd lost her job. It wasn't entirely unexpected. Layoffs had been looming for months, but hearing her manager tell her she was being let go was a crushing blow. It felt like the final crack in the already crumbling foundation of her life. With no savings and mounting bills, Ella didn't know how she would make it through the next month. "Why me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the empty room. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them away. Crying wouldn't change anything. Nothing would. Ella packed up her belongings slowly, each movement feeling heavier than the last. As she walked out of the office for the last time, a cold drizzle began to fall. She pulled her coat tighter around her and started walking toward the park near her apartment. It wasn't the most direct route home, but she needed time to think, or maybe not to think at all. The park was almost deserted, save for a jogger in the distance and a man walking his dog. Ella found an empty bench under a large oak tree and sat down, letting the rain soak through her coat. The cool droplets mixed with the hot tears that she could no longer hold back. She thought about the mistakes that had brought her here, the failed relationships, the missed opportunities, the moments when she'd let fear keep her from taking chances. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped believing she was capable of anything more. The dreams she once had seemed so far away now, like faint memories of someone else's life. As she sat there, she felt a deep sense of hopelessness settle over her. It wasn't just about the job, it was everything. The crushing loneliness, the sense of failure, the nagging thought that she was too broken to ever be whole again. She closed her eyes and let out a shaky breath. "If anyone's listening," she whispered, "I need help. I don't know what to do anymore." It wasn't the first time she had prayed, but it was the first time she had truly surrendered, admitting that she couldn't fix things on her own. She wasn't sure she even believed in prayer anymore. Her faith had been one of the first casualties of her struggles. But in that moment, she had nothing left to lose. As the rain began to let up, Ella felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. It wasn't dramatic. There were no thunderclaps or beams of light shining through the clouds, but it was enough to make her pause. For the first time in months, she felt like she wasn't completely alone. The sensation was fleeting, but it stayed with her as she made her way back home. That night, Ella lay awake in bed, replaying the events of the day in her mind. She felt hollow, like a shell of herself. But somewhere, deep in the recesses of her heart, a tiny flicker of hope had ignited. She couldn't explain it, and she wasn't sure if it would last, but it was there. Before she fell asleep, she whispered one more prayer. "Please, just give me a sign. Let me know I'm not invisible." What Ella didn't know was that her prayer had already been heard. Forces she couldn't begin to comprehend were moving in her life, setting things in motion that would change her path forever. In her darkest moment, when she felt completely beyond saving, the first steps of her redemption were already being taken. This was the breaking point, but it was also the beginning. The park was quiet that evening. except for the rhythmic sound of raindrops falling from the leaves overhead. Ella walked slowly, her head down, lost in thought. The bench where she'd sat earlier still lingered in her mind, a silent witness to her whispered prayer. She hadn't planned to walk back through the park, but her feet seemed to carry her there, as if by instinct. Maybe she was hoping for another moment of peace like the one she'd felt before, fleeting though it had been. The path was dimly lit, with old-fashioned lampposts casting a soft glow along the gravel trail. As Ella passed under the light of one, she noticed a figure standing a few paces ahead. It was a woman, her silhouette illuminated by the lamplight. She was wearing a pale coat that seemed to shimmer faintly, though it wasn't wet from the rain. Something about her presence stopped Ella in her tracks. The woman turned and smiled, her eyes locking with Ella's. There was something familiar about her, though Ella couldn't place it. She wasn't sure why, but she felt no fear, only an overwhelming sense of calm. "Ella," the woman said, her voice warm and melodic. It wasn't a question. She already knew her name. Ella froze. "Do I know you?" she asked, her voice shaky. The woman stepped closer, her movements graceful, almost otherworldly. "Not in the way you think," she replied gently. "But I've been with you for a long time." Ella's mind raced. Was this someone from her past? A distant relative, maybe? But no, there was no recognition, only a strange, unexplainable familiarity, like the feeling of hearing a song you haven't heard in years but still knowing every word. "I don't understand," Ella said finally. "Who are you?" The woman smiled again, her eyes filled with an unearthly kindness. "You can call me Gabriella," she said. "I'm here because you asked for help." The words hit Ella like a gust of wind. She remembered her prayer from earlier that evening, her desperate plea for a sign. But surely this couldn't be real. People didn't just appear out of nowhere, claiming to answer prayers. You heard me?" Ella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Gabriella nodded. "I did, and so did others." "You're not alone, Ella. You never have been." Tears welled up in Ella's eyes. The woman's words felt like a balm on her wounded heart, yet she couldn't fully grasp what was happening. "I don't understand," she said again. "Why me? I made so many mistakes. I don't even know if I believe anymore." Gabriella stepped closer and gently placed a hand on Ella's shoulder. Her touch was warm, comforting. "It doesn't matter how lost you feel," she said softly. "You are deeply loved, more than you can imagine. And your mistakes don't define you. They're part of your story, but they're not the end of it." Ella felt a sob rise in her throat. She didn't know why she felt so safe with this stranger, but her words resonated in a way that nothing else had. It was as if Gabriella could see straight into her soul, into the broken pieces she tried so hard to hide. "Then why does it feel like I'm falling apart?" Ella asked, her voice trembling. "Why does everything I touch seem to go wrong?" Gabriella's expression didn't change, but her eyes grew even softer. "Because sometimes we need to reach the end of ourselves to find the beginning of something greater. You're not falling apart, Ella. You're being reshaped." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ella didn't know what to say. She wanted to believe Gabriella, but the weight of her pain was still so present, so real. "Will it ever get better?" she asked finally, her voice barely audible. "It already is," Gabriella said, her tone filled with certainty. "You just can't see it yet. But you will." For the first time in what felt like years, Ella felt a glimmer of hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. She wiped her tears and looked up at Gabriella, searching for something. Answers, reassurance, anything to make sense of what was happening. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Gabriella smiled. "Because you're worth it. And because you asked." Sometimes all it takes is a single moment of surrender, a single prayer to set things in motion. You may not see it now, but everything in your life is leading you to something beautiful. Ella wanted to hold on to every word, but before she could say anything else, Gabriella took a step back. The light from the lamppost seemed to grow brighter, and for a moment, Ella thought she saw a faint glow surrounding the woman. "Wait," Ella said, panic rising in her chest. "Are you leaving?" Gabriella's smile didn't falter. "I'm always with you, Ella. You just need to remember that." And with that, she was gone. The light dimmed, and the path ahead was empty. Ella stood there, her heart racing, her mind struggling to process what she had just experienced. She looked around, half expecting Gabriella to reappear, but the park was silent. The only sound was the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. Slowly, she began to walk again, her steps lighter than they had been in weeks. By the time she reached her apartment, Ella felt like a different person. She couldn't explain it. Everything in her life was still the same on the surface, but something had shifted inside her. Gabriella's words echoed in her mind. "You are deeply loved. You are not alone." That night, Ella sat by her window, watching the rain. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. And that was enough to start. The days that followed Ella's encounter with Gabriella were unlike anything she'd experienced before. She felt as though a door had opened in her heart, one she hadn't realized was closed. Though life hadn't changed on the surface, her bills still loomed, her fridge still held more empty space than food, and the sting of losing her job remained. There was a subtle shift she couldn't explain. It started with small, almost imperceptible things. On the morning after her meeting with Gabriella, Ella awoke to the sound of birds chirping outside her window. She'd lived in the same apartment for years, yet she couldn't recall ever noticing birdsong before. It wasn't just the sound that struck her. It was the way it seemed to fill her with a quiet sense of peace, as if reminding her that the world hadn't forgotten beauty, even if she had. As she got ready for the day, she found herself humming a tune she hadn't thought of in years, something her grandmother used to sing to her when she was a child. The melody brought a smile to her face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a flicker of light in her heart. But it wasn't until she stepped out of her apartment that she began to notice how these small moments were adding up. The first coincidence came when she passed a small cafe she'd walked by hundreds of times before. The chalkboard sign outside caught her eye. "When you feel like you're drowning, remember, your lifeguard walks on water." Ella stopped in her tracks, the words resonating deeply. She didn't know why, but it felt as though the message had been written just for her. She walked inside, more out of curiosity than anything else, and was greeted by a young barista with a bright smile. "Morning. First cups on the house for new customers," the barista said cheerfully. Ella hesitated. Free coffee wasn't something that happened to her, not in her life. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. The barista nodded. "Absolutely. Just a little kindness to start your day." Ella accepted the coffee, her hands warming around the cup as she stepped back onto the sidewalk. As she sipped the rich, comforting brew, she couldn't help but feel like the universe, or something greater, was sending her a message: "You're not forgotten." Over the next few days, the signs continued. A friend she hadn't spoken to in years called out of the blue, saying she'd been thinking about Ella and wanted to reconnect. When Ella explained her job situation, the friend mentioned a potential opportunity at a company looking for someone with her skills. Though Ella wasn't sure she was ready to believe in miracles, she couldn't deny the timing felt almost too perfect to be chance. The most striking moment came later that week when she decided to visit the park again. The memory of Gabriella lingered in her mind, and she felt drawn to the place where they'd met. As she walked the familiar path, she noticed something shining in the grass just off the trail. Curious, she bent down to pick it up. It was a small, silver pendant in the shape of an angel. The detail was exquisite, with delicate wings and a serene expression on the angel's face. Ella's breath caught as she turned it over in her hands. On the back, an inscription read, "You are not alone." Her hands trembled as she held the pendant. She glanced around, but the park was empty. She thought about Gabriella, about her words, and the way she had vanished into the night. Could this be another sign? Ella didn't know how or why, but she felt certain the pendant was meant for her. Later that evening, as she sat in her apartment turning the pendant over in her hands, she felt a strange mixture of emotions: gratitude, awe, and a lingering disbelief. She wanted to believe that these moments were signs, that Gabriella's presence had set something in motion in her life. But a part of her still doubted. Was she reading too much into things? Could it all just be coincidence? As if to answer her unspoken question, her phone buzzed. It was a text message from her neighbor, a woman named Linda who lived down the hall. The two had exchanged pleasantries in passing, but had never spoken much beyond that. "Nina, I hope this isn't too forward, but I've been thinking about you. I wanted to invite you to join me for a small gathering at my church this weekend. It's just a casual group, tea, conversation, and a little hope. No pressure, but I'd love to have you there." Ella stared at the message, unsure how to respond. She wasn't a churchgoer. She hadn't set foot in one since she was a teenager. But something about the timing of Linda's invitation made her pause. It felt like another thread in the tapestry of strange, wonderful moments that had begun to weave themselves into her life. She typed out a hesitant reply. "Thank you, Linda. I'll think about it." The days passed, and the signs continued. She began noticing numbers that repeated everywhere, on clocks, license plates, even receipts. They were always the same: 1111, 222, 444. A quick search online told her these were often considered angel numbers, symbols of divine guidance and reassurance. Ella wasn't sure what to make of it, but the coincidence was too striking to ignore. By the time Saturday arrived, she had made up her mind. She texted Linda to let her know she would join the gathering. As she walked to the small church on the corner of her neighborhood, she felt a mix of nerves and anticipation. She didn't know what to expect, but something inside her urged her to go. When she arrived, she was greeted warmly by Linda and a small group of people who welcomed her as though they had been waiting for her all along. The gathering wasn't what Ella expected. There was no sermon, no pressure, just people sharing their stories of hope, resilience, and the quiet ways they had felt guided in their own lives. As Ella listened, she felt a stirring in her heart. The stories reminded her of her encounter with Gabriella, of the signs she had been noticing ever since. For the first time, she began to wonder if these moments weren't coincidences at all, but pieces of a larger puzzle, one that was leading her somewhere she was meant to be. That night, as Ella lay in bed, she clutched the angel pendant in her hand. Her doubts hadn't disappeared, but they were quieter now, overshadowed by something new, a sense of wonder. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't walking the path alone. And maybe, just maybe, she never had been. Ella had always considered herself a fighter. For years, she'd carried her burdens alone, refusing to ask for help, believing that if she worked hard enough or willed herself strong enough, she could overcome anything. But lately, something inside her had shifted. The small, inexplicable signs she'd been experiencing, the angel pendant, Linda's invitation, the strange comfort in her heart, were slowly dissolving her need to control everything. It wasn't easy for Ella to let go. Surrender wasn't in her nature. She'd been taught that asking for help was a sign of weakness, that admitting vulnerability made you a burden. But after everything she'd been through, she realized that holding on so tightly hadn't brought her peace. It had only made the weight of her struggles unbearable. Now, she began to wonder if surrendering, letting herself believe that something greater was at work, might be the key to finding freedom. Her first real step in this direction came during the gathering Linda had invited her to. The stories Ella heard that evening stayed with her, replaying in her mind as she went about her week. One story, in particular, struck a chord. A woman named Margaret had shared how she'd felt trapped in a cycle of fear and self-doubt after losing her husband. She explained how, in her darkest hour, she had finally turned to prayer, not out of habit, but out of desperation. "I didn't even know what to say," Margaret had admitted, her voice trembling. "I just sat there and said, I can't do this alone anymore. Please help me." And you know what? That was enough. Help came, not in the way I expected, but in the way I needed. Ella had listened intently, her heart aching at the raw emotion in Margaret's voice. She couldn't explain why, but the story gave her a strange sense of hope. If someone as broken as Margaret could find peace, maybe she could too. The following week, Ella found herself reflecting on the idea of surrender as she walked through the park. It had become a sort of sanctuary for her, a place where she could think without distractions. She stopped at her usual bench, the one where she'd first poured out her heart in a desperate prayer. Closing her eyes, Ella took a deep breath. "Okay," she whispered. "If you're really there, whoever you are, I'm letting go. I don't know what's going to happen, but I can't do this on my own anymore. I'm trusting you to guide me." The words felt strange coming out of her mouth, but also freeing. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to have all the answers. She didn't feel the need to fight her way through life. Instead, she allowed herself to rest in the idea that she wasn't alone. In the days that followed, Ella noticed something remarkable. The weight she'd been carrying, the constant sense of anxiety and dread, began to lift. It wasn't as though her problems disappeared. Her bills still needed paying, and she was still searching for a job, but her perspective shifted. Instead of feeling overwhelmed, she started to see her challenges as opportunities for growth. One morning, Ella was sitting at her kitchen table, reviewing job postings on her laptop, when she received an email from an old college acquaintance. They hadn't spoken in years, but the message was warm and casual. "Hi, Ella. I hope this email finds you well. I know this is out of the blue, but I remembered you used to work in marketing, and my company is looking for someone with your skills. If you're interested, let me know. I'd be happy to recommend you." Ella stared at the screen, her heart pounding. She couldn't believe the timing. Just days ago, she'd been praying for guidance, and now this opportunity had landed in her inbox. She quickly responded, expressing her interest and gratitude, and within hours, her acquaintance replied with details about the position. The job wasn't just a chance to get back on her feet financially. It was also at a company that aligned with her values, something she'd never prioritized in the past. As she prepared for the interview, Ella couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than a coincidence. It felt like another piece of the puzzle falling into place. But the most significant moment came later that week, when Ella encountered a homeless man sitting outside the grocery store. Normally, she might have walked by, offering a polite smile, but nothing more. But something about this man caught her attention. He wasn't begging or holding a sign. He was simply sitting there, his eyes closed, as if in quiet reflection. Ella hesitated for a moment, then decided to approach him. She crouched down and gently placed a sandwich and a bottle of water beside him. The man opened his eyes and looked at her, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft. "You didn't have to do that." Ella felt her throat tighten. "It's nothing," she replied. "I just thought you might be hungry." The man studied her for a moment, his gaze kind but piercing. "Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness make the biggest difference," he said. "Don't underestimate what you just did." As Ella walked away, she couldn't stop thinking about his words. She realized that surrender wasn't just about trusting a higher power. It was also about opening her heart to others. For so long, She'd been so focused on her own struggles that she hadn't noticed the opportunities to make a difference in the lives of those around her. In the weeks that followed, Ella continued to practice surrender. She started volunteering at a local community center, offering her time and skills to help others in need. It wasn't just a way to give back. It became a source of healing for her. As she listened to the stories of those she served, she found herself feeling less alone. She began to see her own pain as a bridge that connected her to others, rather than as a barrier that isolated her. One evening, as Ella sat on her couch reflecting on everything that had happened since her encounter with Gabriella, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. Her life was still far from perfect, but it was richer, fuller, and more meaningful than it had been in years. She picked up the angel pendant that had become her constant companion and held it in her hands. "Thank you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know where this journey is leading me, but I trust that I'm not walking it alone." In that moment, Ella realized that surrender wasn't about giving up. It was about letting go of the need to control every outcome and trusting that she was being guided towards something beautiful. It was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Ella never imagined that her brokenness could become a source of strength for others. But that was exactly what began to happen. As she embraced her journey of surrender and faith, she found herself drawn to people who were struggling in ways that mirrored her own past. It wasn't intentional, at least not at first, but life seemed to place them in her path as if guided by an unseen hand. Her volunteer work at the community center quickly became one of the most fulfilling parts of her life. It started simply enough, with her helping to organize clothing donations and prepare meals for families in need. But over time, Ella began to notice something. People gravitated toward her. They opened up to her in ways that surprised her, sharing their fears, their regrets, and their hopes. She listened intently, often recognizing echoes of her own pain in their words. One afternoon, a young woman named Claire approached Ella in the community center's kitchen. Claire was in her early 20s, with tired eyes that betrayed a weight far heavier than her years. She'd been coming to the center for weeks, but this was the first time she'd spoken to Ella directly. "Hi," Claire said hesitantly. "Do you mind if I talk to you for a minute?" Over the next few weeks, Ella found herself having similar conversations with others at the center. There was David, an elderly man who had lost his wife and felt adrift without her. There was Maria, a single mother trying to provide for her children while battling her own feelings of inadequacy. And there was Jamal, a teenager who felt invisible in a world that seemed to overlook him at every turn. Each interaction reminded Ella of the powerful truth Gabriella had shared with her. No one is ever truly alone, even in their darkest moments. The act of reminding others of this truth became a source of healing for Ella as well. With every life she touched, she felt her own wounds closing a little more. But it wasn't just at the community center that Ella began to see her purpose unfolding. One evening, as she walked home through the park, she noticed an older woman sitting on a bench, looking distressed. Ella hesitated for a moment. She didn't want to intrude, but something urged her to approach. "Excuse me," Ella said gently. "Are you all right?" The woman looked up, her eyes red from crying. "Oh, I'm fine," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. Ella sat down beside her. "Sometimes it helps to talk," she offered. "If you'd like, I'm here to listen." For the next half hour, the woman, whose name was Evelyn, shared her story. She'd recently lost her home in a fire and was struggling to rebuild her life. Though she had family nearby, she didn't want to burden them with her problems. As Ella listened, she felt an overwhelming sense of connection to Evelyn. She reached in her pocket and pulled out the angel pendant she'd found weeks earlier. She'd carried it with her everywhere since that day, but in this moment, she felt a strong urge to give it away. "This helped me when I needed it most," Ella said, placing the pendant in Evelyn's hand. I think it's meant to help you now. Evelyn looked down at the pendant, her fingers trembling as she traced its delicate wings. Tears streamed down her face. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to, Ella said, smiling. Just know that you're not alone. As Ella walked home that night, she felt a profound sense of peace. Giving away the pendant, a symbol of her own journey, felt like a way of passing on the hope she'd been given. She realized that her purpose wasn't about fixing others or solving their problems. It was about being a presence of love and encouragement, reminding them of their own strength and worth. Ella's life continued to unfold in ways she never could have imagined. She got the job she'd interviewed for and found a sense of stability she hadn't felt in years. But more importantly, she discovered a deep sense of fulfillment in helping others, a purpose that gave her life new meaning. One evening, as she sat by her window watching the sunset, Ella thought of Gabriella. She hadn't seen her since that night in the park, but she felt her presence everywhere, in the signs, the people she met, and the quiet moments of grace that filled her days. Ella whispered a silent prayer of gratitude, not just for the blessings she'd received, but for the chance to share them with others. She knew her journey wasn't over, but she also knew she wasn't walking it alone. And for the first time in her life, that was enough. Ella's journey had taken her through valleys of despair and into a brighter place than she'd ever imagined. But one question lingered in her heart. Who was Gabriella, and why had she appeared in her life? Though Ella hadn't seen her since that night in the park, she couldn't shake the feeling that Gabriella's presence was still with her, guiding her, protecting her. It wasn't just the memory of their conversation that stayed with Ella. It was the way her life had changed since their encounter. The once overwhelming weight of hopelessness had lifted, replaced by a sense of purpose and connection she'd never known before. Even the smallest moments of her day seemed infused with meaning now, as if each one were a thread in a tapestry being woven by unseen hands. One crisp autumn morning, Ella decided to take a walk in the park where she'd met Gabriella. She hadn't planned to return to that exact spot. It had been months since their meeting, but something deep inside her felt drawn there, as though an invisible force was guiding her steps. As she reached the familiar bench under the old oak tree, Ella stopped and smiled. The bench looked the same as it had that rainy night, but the person sitting on it was very different. She was no longer the broken, desperate woman who had cried out for help. She was someone stronger, someone who had learned to trust in a higher power and in herself. Ella sat down, the cool metal of the bench pressing against her hands. She closed her eyes and let the autumn breeze wash over her. The park was quiet, save for the occasional chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves in the wind. It felt like the perfect place to reflect on everything that had happened. She thought about the people she'd met along the way. Claire, who had found a part-time job and was starting to rebuild her life. Evelyn, who had moved in with her daughter and was finally allowing herself to be cared for. And even Linda, whose simple invitation had been a turning point in Ella's journey. Each of these connections felt like a thread tying her life to others, creating a network of love and support that she hadn't realized existed before. As she sat there, lost in thought, a sudden movement caught her eye. Turning, she saw a young boy chasing a butterfly across the path. The boy's laughter echoed through the park, a sound so pure and joyful that it brought a smile to Ella's face. For a moment, she envied his innocence, the way he seemed so free, so untouched by the burdens of life. But then she realized something. She too was learning to live with that kind of joy again. The boy's mother appeared a moment later, hurrying after him with a patient smile. She glanced at Ella and gave her a nod of acknowledgement, a simple gesture that felt warm and meaningful. Ella nodded back, her heart swelling with gratitude for the small, beautiful moments that had become such a big part of her life. As the mother and child disappeared down the path, Ella leaned back on the bench and let out a contented sigh. "Thank you," she whispered, her words carried away by the breeze. "Thank you for everything." The words had barely left her lips when she felt it, a presence, unmistakable and deeply comforting. It wasn't physical. There was no sound or shadow, but it was there, as real as the bench beneath her and the wind on her face. Ella. The voice was soft, familiar, and filled with love. She opened her eyes and looked around, but no one was there. Her heart began to race, not with fear, but with awe. "Gabriella," she said aloud, her voice trembling. Though she couldn't see her, Ella knew it was her. The warmth in the air, the peace that enveloped her. It was just like that night in the park. She didn't need to see Gabriella to know she was there. "You've come so far," the voice said, resonating deep within Ella's soul. "I'm so proud of you." Tears filled Ella's eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said. "You saved me." Gabriella's voice was gentle but firm. "No, Ella, you saved yourself. I was simply here to remind you of what was already inside you." Ella shook her head, overcome with emotion. "But I was so lost. I didn't believe I could be saved. And yet, here you are," Gabriella replied. "Do you see now? Even in your darkest moments, you were never alone. You were always loved, always guided." Ella thought back to all the signs, the seemingly small moments that had brought her to where she was now. The cafe sign, the angel pendant, Linda's invitation. They all seemed so insignificant at the time, yet each one had been a step on her path. "Will I ever see you again?" Ella asked, her voice barely a whisper. Gabriella's response was both comforting and bittersweet. "I'm always with you, Ella. In the love you give, in the hope you inspire, and in the lives you touch. My work here is done, but your journey is just beginning." Ella closed her eyes, letting the tears fall freely. When she opened them again, the warmth had faded, and the park was quiet once more. But she didn't feel alone. If anything, she felt more connected than ever, to herself, to others, and to the divine presence that had carried her through her darkest days. As she stood to leave, Ella felt a renewed sense of purpose. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she was ready for it. She would continue to live her life as Gabriella had taught her, not in fear or doubt, but in love and trust. Before leaving the park, Ella took one last look at the bench. She smiled, knowing it would always be a sacred place for her, a reminder of the night her life began to change. With a heart full of gratitude, she whispered one final word into the autumn air: "Thank you." And as she walked away, the leaves rustled gently in the wind, as if carrying her gratitude to the heavens.